I am Captain Lena Weber, 29 years old. Last Saturday, I drove 4 hours from the military medical base back home. Before I could even kick off my combat boots, my father threw a tattered floral apron at my chest. Garrett's girlfriend is coming over, he barked, his eyes never leaving the TV screen. Get to the garage and wash those dishes. Don't embarrass your brother. I stood there, clenching that apron so hard my knuckles turned white. On the battlefield, I'm the officer who decides if people live or die. But in this house, my voice is dead air. I'm just a ghost in the background. Then the front door opened. My brother's perfect girlfriend stepped in. But the moment her eyes hit mine, her rehearsed smile died. She froze. What happened next tore the mask right off my family's lies. Before I take you back to that dinner, take a second to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I really want to know. Now, let's go back 3 days. When that fatal call first came in, the smell of industrial-grade antiseptic was everywhere. It crawled into your skin and stayed there. It was Wednesday afternoon at Brooke Army Medical Center, BAMC. Inside the rehab wing, the air was thick with the sound of struggle. The squeak of sneakers on rubber mats, the heavy rhythmic thud of a weighted ball, the low hum of the AC trying to fight the San Antonio heat. I was down on one knee on a blue foam mat. My spine was a straight line, my shoulders squared. I didn't feel the sweat stinging my eyes. I only felt the weight of Marcus, a 5-year-old with cerebral palsy, leaning against my palms. My hands were rough, calloused from years of field training and heavy lifting. They were the hands of a soldier, but right now, they were a cage of safety for a kid who didn't know if his legs would ever listen to him. Marcus gritted his teeth. His face was beet red, a vein in his neck throbbing with the effort. He gripped a small plastic spoon, shaking, fighting to bring a glob of mashed potatoes to his mouth. I didn't say, "Good job," or "You can do it." Platitudes are for civilians. I gave him a steady gaze. The look an officer gives a private they know can finish the march. The Velcro patch on my OCP sleeve, the one with the little dinosaur Marcus gave me, peeled back slightly as he leaned in. He did it. The spoon hit his lips. A silent victory. No applause, just the heavy silence of a human being reclaiming their own life. That's when the phone in my cargo pocket started vibrating. It didn't just ring, it felt like a tactical alert. I pulled it out, my eyes still locked on Marcus to make sure he didn't lose his balance. The screen read, "Dad." I swiped green. I didn't get a "Hey, honey," or "How's the shift?" What I got was the wet, rhythmic smack of chewing gum. It was a sound that made my skin crawl. Behind it, the blare of a sports commentator screaming about a touchdown. Richard Weber was at home, feet up, probably nursing a lukewarm Budweiser. "Garrett's bringing his girl over Saturday," he barked. His voice was thick with that lazy high school coach authority he never outgrew. "I need you here at 1600 hours. I glanced at the digital clock on the wall. "I've got a critical session with a patient Saturday at 1400, Dad. I can't cancel. These kids depend on the schedule." "A kid hobbling around on a mat ain't more important than this family, Lena," he snapped. The gum smacking stopped. That was the warning shot. "Your mother's porcelain sets are down in the garage. They're covered in dust. Get them out, scrub 'em, line 'em up. Garrett's finally got a winner this time. Don't you dare embarrass your brother by looking like a grease monkey." "I'm a doctor of physical therapy, Dad, not a dishwasher. You're my daughter, and you'll do what I say as long as you're a Weber. Saturday, 1600. Don't be late." Click. The dial tone was a long, sharp needle piercing my eardrum. I stood up slowly. My knees popped. Marcus looked up at me, his eyes wide and innocent. He didn't know that the woman who just helped him walk was just called a volunteer in her own home. The devaluation hit like a physical blow to the gut. It didn't matter that I had a PhD. It didn't matter that the Army put silver bars on my shoulders and trusted me with the broken bodies of its finest warriors. To Richard, I was just a utility. A tool to be used and put back in the shed. I stepped out into the hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. I leaned my forehead against the cold brick wall. It was a habit I picked up in the field when the shelling got too close. Find something solid and hold on. Suddenly, the smell of the clinic vanished. It was replaced by the cloying, sweet stench of a hospice ward 3 years ago. Bleach and dying flowers. I could still feel my mother's hand. It was a bird's wing, frail, translucent, cold. She had gripped my wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible for a woman riddled with stage 4 cancer. She pulled me close, her breath smelling like copper and peppermint. "Keep this family together, Lena," she had rasped. It wasn't a request. It was an order, a dying woman's final contract. "Don't let them drift. Promise me." A soldier doesn't break a vow to the dead. I straightened my OCP collar. I checked the alignment of my belt. Everything was squared away. On the outside, I was a flawless officer of the United States Army. On the inside, I was a prisoner to a 5-word sentence. I walked toward the exit, the heavy glass doors swinging open. The Texas sun hit me like a furnace. I climbed into my Jeep, the engine roaring to life with a violent, mechanical growl. I gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. I knew exactly what was waiting for me. A garage full of dust. A father who viewed me as furniture. A brother who wouldn't look me in the eye while I scrubbed his floors. I shifted into gear and pulled out of the BAMC parking lot. I was driving 4 hours into a psychological ambush, and the worst part was, I was the one paying for the gas. As the needle hit 70 on I-35, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The soldier was there. But for the first time in 10 years, I wondered if she was strong enough to survive a dinner table. 16 hours. Saturday. The Jeep Wrangler's engine gave one final violent rattle before dying in the driveway. I sat there for a second, my hands still fused to the steering wheel, watching the heat waves shimmer off the yellow, dying grass of the Weber lawn. The house didn't look like a home. It looked like a tired, peeling monument to a man who had stopped caring the day he lost his whistle. I stepped out. The Texas sun was a weight on my shoulders. I moved across the porch, the wood groaning under my combat boots like it was echoing my own internal fatigue. I didn't knock. I just turned the knob and walked into the chemical fog of pine-scented air freshener and the sharp, sour tang of stale Budweiser. Richard was exactly where I'd left him in my nightmares. He was buried in that cracked leather recliner, his belly straining against a stained polo shirt. The TV was blaring a baseball game, crowds cheering for a world he wasn't part of anymore. He didn't turn his head. He just hasted a thumb toward the back of the house. "Dishes are in the garage. They're thick with dust. Don't take all day," he barked, eyes locked on a fly ball. I didn't give him a single word. I shifted the weight of my duffel bag and headed for the stairs. All I wanted was 10 minutes. 10 minutes to peel off this sweat-soaked OCP uniform, wash the hospital smell off my skin, and find a moment of peace in the only 4 walls that were supposed to be mine. I reached the landing. My hand went to the brass knob of my bedroom door. I took a breath, expecting the scent of the cedar chest Mom gave me. Expecting the quiet sanctuary of the desk where I'd studied for my PhD while the world slept. I pushed the door open. The air in my lungs turned to lead. My defense perimeters didn't just crumble, they were pulverized. The room was a hollowed-out shell. My bed? Gone. My desk? Vanished. My childhood? Erased like a chalkboard in a hurricane. In their place was a 65-inch black hole of a TV screen mounted to the wall. It sat there like a victory flag. The floor was littered with styrofoam bait boxes, tangled fishing lures, and a rusty weight bench that looked like it hadn't seen a plate in years. 23 years of my life had been cleared out to make a man cave for a 60-year-old who spent his days rotting in a recliner. I stood there, paralyzed. I looked at the space above the window. The oak shelf was gone. The heart of the room, the glass case, was missing. Inside that case were 23 glass butterflies. Mom had spent 15 years hunting them down in antique shops across the state, from Fredericksburg to Austin. They weren't just decorations. They were the only things I had left of her touch. I turned around. My boots hit the wooden stairs with the rhythm of a firing squad. I found Richard in the living room, still nursing his beer. "Where's the stuff from my room, Richard?" My voice was flat, colder than a San Antonio winter. He took a slow swig of beer, wiped the foam from his lip with the back of a calloused hand. "Packed it in a cardboard box. Threw it out in the garage," he muttered, his eyes never leaving the game. "I'm taking the whole lot to the flea market in the morning. Figured I could get $1 apiece for 'em. Better than letting 'em collect dust in my TV room." $1. That was the price he'd put on Mom's love. That was the value of my existence in this house, 99 cents plus tax. I felt the blood drain from my face, my military discipline holding my rage back like a failing dam. My knuckles cracked as I balled my fists. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I turned on my heel and walked straight through the kitchen to the garage. The air out there was hot and stagnant. I found the box tucked under a stack of old newspapers and a leaking bag of fertilizer. It was covered in cobwebs. I knelt down, my fingers trembling as I pulled back the flaps. There they were, the butterflies, shoved together like trash. I lifted the case. None were broken. Not yet. I carried it out to the Jeep. I tucked it into the back seat, shielded from the sun, and slammed the door shut. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the most satisfying thing I'd heard all year. The mission had changed. I wasn't here to keep a family together anymore. I was here to salvage what was left before the fire took everything. Have you ever felt like a ghost in your own childhood home? If you've ever had a parent treat your most precious memories like yard sale junk, comment "not for sale" below. I want to hear your stories of surviving this kind of betrayal. Your support keeps me going, so please hit that like button and subscribe to see how I settle this debt. I walked back into the house. I could hear voices in the kitchen now, high, arrogant laughter. The golden child had arrived. I stepped into the kitchen. Garrett was standing by the fridge, looking like he'd just won the lottery, holding a cheap bottle of wine. He looked at my OCPs, then at the dirt on my hands from the garage. "Hey, Lena," he smirked, his eyes flickering toward Dad in the other room. "Don't look so sour. You're gonna mess up the mood for Claire." The campaign had officially begun. The screech of tires on the gravel driveway was the first warning. It wasn't the steady, controlled stop of someone who respected the machine. It was the arrogant slide of someone who knew someone else would pay for the tires. Garrett was home. I stood in the kitchen, my back to the door, staring at a bag of potatoes that needed peeling. The OCPs felt heavy now, the fabric stiff with the salt of a 12-hour shift at BAMC. I didn't turn around when the screen door slammed. I didn't need to. "Pop, I'm here!" Garrett's voice boomed, dripping with that rehearsed salesman charm. Richard, who had been a permanent fixture in his recliner for the last 2 hours, moved faster than I'd seen him move in years. The springs groaned as he launched himself toward the door. The air in the house suddenly shifted, charged with a frantic, desperate energy. "My boy, how's the business, son?" Richard's face was glowing, a stark contrast to the gray, slumped mask he wore when he looked at me. Garrett stepped into the light, wearing a linen blazer that was too wrinkled to be professional and a smirk that was too wide to be honest. In his hand, he clutched a bottle of red wine. I could see the gas station price tag still stuck to the glass. $9.99 of fermented vinegar. Richard grabbed the bottle like it was the Holy Grail, holding it up to the flickering kitchen light. "Look at this. Top shelf. We're eating like kings tonight." My stomach turned. Last Thanksgiving, I'd spent $300 on a heritage turkey and 12 hours at the stove. I'd seasoned every inch of that bird with the same precision I used to debride a wound. Richard had chewed through it in silence, complaining that the gravy was a bit thin. But today, a $10 bottle of rot gut made Garrett a god. I walked past them to put the potatoes in the sink. Richard's eyes snapped to me, the warmth vanishing instantly. His lip curled as his gaze traveled over my operational camouflage pattern, the uniform I'd earned through blood, sweat, and a doctorate degree. "Get that dusty junk off," he snapped, his voice dropping an octave. "You smell like a damn bunker. We've got guests coming. You look like a grunt, not a Weber. I looked at Garrett. He was leaning against the counter, picking at his fingernails. He knew exactly what these bars on my shoulders meant. He sold equipment to my hospital. He saw officers like me every day, and he usually had to wait in their lobbies until they were ready to see him. Garrett, I said, my voice low. He didn't look up. He just shrugged, a pathetic, non-committal twitch of his shoulders. He's right, Lena. It's a dinner party. Don't make it weird. The betrayal was a cold blade between my ribs. I didn't argue. I went to the mudroom, peeled off my OCP jacket, and draped it over a chair. Then I reached for Mom's old floral apron. It was thin, stained with years of grease, and smelled like dust. As I looped the string over my head and tied it tight around my waist, it felt like a noose. I wasn't an officer anymore. I was the help. 10 minutes later, the kitchen was filled with the aggressive hiss of steak hitting a hot pan. The smoke began to coil around the ceiling fans. Garrett wandered back in, fumbling with a plastic corkscrew he'd found in a drawer. I didn't give him an inch. I moved with the calculated efficiency of a field surgeon, cornering him between the island and the fridge. I stood tall, my back straight, using the same command presence that made privates snap to attention. You sell ventilators to BAMC, Garrett? I hissed, my voice barely a whisper but sharp enough to draw blood. You stand at attention when officers with my rank walk past you in those halls. You know exactly what I do there. Garrett stopped twisting the cork. He looked everywhere but at my eyes. Lena, come on, this ain't the time. He just called me a volunteer, Garrett. He told Claire I read stories to kids for free. He's erasing me, and you're just standing there drinking cheap wine. He finally looked at me, but there was no fire in his eyes. Just the dull, gray film of a coward. Look, just let it be, he whispered, his eyes darting toward the living room where Richard was shouting at the TV. Correcting him just starts a fight. It ain't worth the headache. Just play along, Lena. It's easier that way. Easier for you, I said. The cork popped with a wet, pathetic sound. Garrett grabbed the bottle and practically ran out of the kitchen, leaving me alone in the smoke and the smell of searing meat. In the Army, we have a saying, never leave a fallen comrade. On the battlefield, people I'd only known for a week would risk a bullet to drag me to safety. In this house, my own brother was willing to sell my soul for a quiet dinner. I stared at the steaks. They were perfectly seared, just the way Richard liked them. I felt a sudden, violent urge to throw the whole pan through the window. Instead, I grabbed a plate. I was alone. I had always been alone. The uniform was gone, the apron was tied, and the golden child was out there soaking up the lies. Then, the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the house like a siren. Richard yelled for me to open the door. Garrett smoothed his blazer. The performance was about to begin. But as I walked toward the hallway, I felt something shift deep in my gut. Garrett thought playing along was the easy way out. He didn't realize that when you push a soldier too far, they stop following orders. I reached for the handle. My hand was steady. My heart was a drum. On the other side of that door was the one person who knew the truth. The one person Garrett hadn't accounted for. I pulled the door open. The mission had just gone live. 17:30 hours. The stage was set for a performance I hadn't auditioned for. The living room of the Weber house felt like a pressurized chamber, the air thick with the smell of heavy furniture polish and that cheap, flowery spray people use to hide a basement leak. Richard stood by the hearth, chest puffed out and gut sucked in beneath a navy blue polo shirt that still had the stiff factory creases. He was in full high school coach mode, mobilizing every soul he could find to witness the return of his golden child. The guests were already rooted in their spots. Grandma Margot sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, her hands fluttering over her purse like trapped birds. Aunt June was tucked into the corner, nursing a lukewarm iced tea and staring at the carpet with a look of quiet, practiced endurance. Even the neighbors, the Pattersons, were there, looking stiff and miserable in their Sunday best. It was a Broadway production of The All-American Family, directed by a man who couldn't even tell you his daughter's military rank. "Lena, door, now!" Richard bellowed. He didn't look at me. He was too busy adjusting a framed photo of Garrett on the mantel. I was standing near the kitchen entrance, holding a silver tray of water glasses. The condensation was cold against my palms, but the floral apron wrapped around my waist felt like it was made of lead. It was damp and spotted with grease from the steaks, a stark contrast to the way my spine refused to bend. I'd spent 10 years training my body to stand like a pillar of the United States Army. Now, I was being used as a prop in a domestic lie. I walked down the hallway. My combat boots were gone, replaced by a pair of old flat shoes that made my heels click against the oak floor with a hollow, rhythmic sound. It was the sound of a woman marching toward a firing squad. The doorbell rang again, sharper this time. It cut through the fake laughter and the dull hum of the AC. I pulled the heavy oak door open. The Texas heat tried to shove its way inside, but it stopped dead when it hit Claire. She was 28, tall, and carried herself with the kind of effortless grace that only comes from money and a clean conscience. She was wearing a silk dress, the color of a bruised plum, and clutching a bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet that probably cost more than Richard's monthly pension. She had a rehearsed, polite smile on her face, ready to be the perfect guest. But the second her eyes met mine, that smile didn't just fade. It died. Her pupils blew out wide, swallowing the blue of her irises. Her jaw went slack, her breath catching in a small, wet hitch in the back of her throat. The silk of her dress rippled as her entire body went rigid like a stone statue. The wine bottle in her hand tilted, slipping through her manicured fingers until she gripped the neck with white-knuckled desperation. "My God," she whispered. The words weren't for the model family waiting inside. They were heavy, jagged, and dropped into the hallway like spent brass. "Lena." It wasn't the greeting of a stranger. It was the voice of a woman who had spent over a year sitting in a sterile hallway at BAMC, watching me through a glass partition. She had watched me kneel on a cold hospital floor, sweat soaking through my OCPs, as I fought to keep her 6-year-old sister, Lily, from giving up. In Claire's world, I wasn't a girl in a greasy apron. I was the officer who brought her sister back from the dead. Now, she was staring at her hero, the powerful Captain Weber, standing in a dim hallway, bearing a tray of tap water like a common servant. Richard broke the silence with a loud, booming laugh that felt as fake as a $3 bill. He stepped up behind me, clapping Garrett on the shoulder so hard the boy nearly stumbled into the coat rack. "Get in here, girl! Don't just stand there catching flies!" Richard barked, his voice dripping with forced hospitality. He didn't notice the way Claire was trembling. He didn't notice the way the air had turned to ice. He just reached out and shoved my shoulder with the back of his hand. "Lena, get that tray out of the way. You're blocking the entrance. Go check the oven." He spoke to me like I was a dog that had wandered into the house by mistake. Claire's eyes didn't leave mine. They were burning now, a mixture of horror and a growing, sharp-edged fury that made my heart hammer against my ribs. I gave her a single, sharp shake of my head. It was a tactical signal. Hold position. Do not engage. Claire swallowed hard, her throat moving in a jagged line. She looked at Richard, then at Garrett, who was standing there with a smug grin, waiting to be introduced to the woman he thought he'd tricked. She looked at them like they were something she'd found under a rock. She tightened her grip on the wine bottle, took a jagged breath, and stepped over the threshold. Her heels clicked on the floor, a slow, deliberate march toward the dining room. Richard didn't know it yet, but he'd just invited a witness to his own execution. He thought he was the director of this play. He had no idea the guest was about to burn the theater down. Claire walked into the dining room and sat down. She didn't look at the meat. She didn't look at the wine. She just stared at Richard with a look that would have sent a seasoned insurgent running for cover. I stood in the shadows of the hallway, the silver tray still in my hands. The mission was live, and the first shot was about to be fired. The roast beef sat in the center of the table, sweating under the harsh yellow light of the dining room chandelier. It was a massive gray slab of meat dripping with a brown gravy that looked more like motor oil than food. The Pattersons were already sawing through their portions, the sound of serrated knives scraping against porcelain like a chorus of nails on a chalkboard. There was no chair for me. I stood near the edge of the kitchen wall, my arms crossed over the grease-stained floral apron. I was a sentry in my own home, a ghost standing watch over a feast I wasn't allowed to join. Richard sat at the head of the table, his face flushed red from the third glass of that gas station wine. He leaned back, the buttons of his polo shirt straining, and tapped his glass with a fork to call for attention. "Listen up, folks," Richard boomed, his voice vibrating with that fake, chest-thumping pride he only used when there was an audience. He gestured toward Garrett, who was sitting there looking like a man who'd just inherited the world despite never having done a day's work in his life. "I want to take a moment to recognize my son. Garrett just closed 3 massive contracts with the regional clinics. He's practically single-handedly keeping the medical industry in this county afloat. A real businessman. A real Weber." Garrett puffed his chest out, a smug, oily grin spreading across his face. Mrs. Patterson let out a little chirp of approval and clapped her hands. Garrett didn't look at me. He just kept cutting his meat, shoveling a huge, bloody piece of beef into his mouth and chewing with a wet, rhythmic smack that made my stomach turn. Then, Richard's eyes flickered toward me. The warmth in them died instantly, replaced by the dull, flat look he gave the trash cans on a Tuesday morning. He tossed a dismissive hand in my direction. "And then there's Leanie," Richard said, his tone shifting to something that sounded like pity mixed with a deep, underlying shame. "She's been staying down at the Army clinic. She does some volunteer work there, mostly reading stories to the kids and helping out with little errands when they're short-staffed. It keeps her busy since she's still trying to find her footing." The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest, more violent than any recoil I'd felt on a firing range. Volunteer work, reading stories. At BAMC, I was the one who determined whether a soldier's leg stayed or went. I was the one who calculated the precise neurological load for patients whose brains had been scrambled by IEDs. I carried the weight of life and death in my palms every single day. But here, in this room, Richard had stripped me of my doctorate, my captain's bars, and my dignity in 3 lazy sentences. He'd turned a decorated officer into a babysitter who couldn't hold down a real job. Claire's fork froze halfway to her mouth. She looked at Richard, her brow furrowing into a sharp V of confusion and disbelief. She turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto mine, searching for some sign that she'd heard him wrong. "Volunteer work, sir?" Claire's voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a siren. She swirled the wine in her glass, her eyes narrowing. "I was under the impression that the work done at BAMC was—" Richard didn't even let her finish. He chopped the air with his hand, a sharp, violent motion that silenced the table. "Just a way to kill time, Claire," Richard said, flashing her a grin that was all teeth and no soul. The girl's never been one to settle down. Too much of her mother's flightiness in her. But enough about that. "Garrett, tell Claire about that lunker you pulled out of the lake last weekend. 12 pounds, right?" Richard used a base fishing story to bury my career as a doctor. He was gaslighting her right in front of me, rewriting my entire life so it didn't overshadow the mediocre, golden child sitting across from him. Garrett didn't correct him. He didn't even flinch. He just nodded, his mouth full of beef, and started rambling about lure depths and water temperatures. I stood there, my back pressed against the cold kitchen wall. My jaw was clenched so hard my teeth felt like they were going to shatter. I didn't say a word. I let him do it. I let him expose every rotten, selfish, narcissistic fiber of his being to the woman who actually knew who I was. I was a soldier. And in the military, sometimes you have to wait for the enemy to overextend themselves before you strike. Richard laughed at one of Garrett's jokes, a loud wheezing sound that made his belly shake. He reached for the bottle of wine, his hand trembling with greed. Across the table, Claire's face had gone as white as the linens. She wasn't eating anymore. She sat perfectly still, her eyes tracking Richard like he was a target in a sniper's crosshairs. Then, she did it. Claire opened her hand and let her fork drop. Clang. The sound of the metal hitting the porcelain plate was like a gunshot in a tomb. The laughter died instantly. Richard's hand froze over the wine bottle. Garrett stopped chewing. Everyone at the table turned to look at her. Claire didn't look at Richard. She didn't look at Garrett. She just stared straight ahead, her lips curling into a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. The pin had been pulled, and the explosion was about to begin. The apple pie sat on the table, a heap of store-bought crust and syrupy cinnamon that smelled too sweet for a room this sour. Richard had a toothpick dancing between his teeth, his face flushed with the kind of arrogance that only comes from a man who thinks he's won a war without firing a shot. He was mid-sentence, rambling about a 1994 high school championship, his voice a dull drone against the humming of the old refrigerator. Claire didn't wait for the punchline. She didn't even look at him. The silence that followed the clang of her fork was absolute. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that happens right before a thunderstorm rips the sky open. June stopped mid-chew, her hand frozen with a napkin halfway to her mouth. Garrett was staring at his plate, his ears turning a bright, guilty red. Claire shifted in her seat. Her silk dress hissed against the wooden chair, a sharp, expensive sound in a house that smelled like dust and old grease. She turned her head slowly, ignoring Richard entirely, and locked her eyes on me. I was still standing by the wall, the floral apron a cruel joke against my frame. Lena. Claire's voice was a razor, short, sharp, surgical. Which department at BAMC did you say you worked in? The question hung in the air like a live wire. Richard's jaw tightened. He tried to laugh it off, a rough, grating sound that died in his throat when Claire didn't join in. Pediatric rehabilitation, I said. My voice was steady, level. The voice of a commanding officer reporting to the front. Claire's gaze shifted to Garrett. Her eyes were burning now, a cold blue fire that made him shrink into his blazer. You told me she was a volunteer, Garrett. You told me she was reading stories because she couldn't find a real career. You sat in my apartment and laughed about it. Garrett fumbled with his wine glass, nearly tipping it over. I just meant, it's a family thing, Claire. Don't get all worked up. Worked up? Claire's voice rose, hitting a pitch that made the glass cabinets rattle. Richard tried to slam his hand on the table to regain control, but Claire beat him to it. She stood up, her chair screeching back across the floorboards. 2 years ago, my 6-year-old sister, Lily, was pulled out of a crushed SUV. The doctors at the local trauma center said her spine was a mess of bone and hope. They said she'd never take another step without a machine. She leaned over the table, her shadow falling across Richard's face. He looked up at her, his mouth hanging open, the toothpick finally falling onto his shirt. We transferred her to BAMC because we were told there was one person, just one, who specialized in cases that everyone else had written off. They told us about a captain, a doctor of physical therapy, who was so stubborn she'd spend 6 hours a day on her knees on a cold gym floor just to get a kid to wiggle a toe. The room was a vacuum. I could hear Aunt June's breath coming in short, jagged hitches. Mrs. Patterson was covering her mouth with both hands, her eyes darting between Claire and the woman in the grease-stained apron. I sat in that hallway for 14 months, Claire hissed, her voice trembling with a fury that had been building since she stepped over the threshold. I watched that captain work. I watched her sweat through her OCPs. I watched her scream at insurance adjusters who tried to cut Lily's funding. I watched her carry my sister across a room when Lily's legs gave out. Claire turned, her finger pointing straight at my chest. It felt like a spotlight. That woman isn't a volunteer. She's the reason my sister is playing soccer in the backyard right now. She's the most decorated pediatric specialist in the United States Army Medical Corps. And you have her standing against a wall like a servant while you brag about selling ventilators. Richard's face went from red to a sickly, mottled gray. He looked at me, then at Claire, his brain trying to find a lie big enough to cover the hole she'd just punched in his reality. Now hold on, Claire. You've got it all wrong. Lena's always been difficult. We just didn't want to. Shut up, Richard, Claire snapped. The disrespect was a physical blow. Richard flinched like she'd slapped him. Claire walked around the table, her heels clicking a slow, deliberate rhythm on the floor. She stopped a foot away from me. Her face was wet with tears, but her eyes were clear. Lena, she whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. Do you remember Lily? Red hair? She was terrified of the parallel bars. I took a step forward, my boots finally leaving the shadow of the wall. The movement was crisp, disciplined. I wasn't the ghost of a daughter anymore. I was the officer Claire remembered. Lily Brennan, I said. The name tasted like iron and victory. She called the parallel bars the scary bridges. She wouldn't cross them unless I promised to buy her a strawberry milkshake every Friday. Claire let out a sob, a jagged sound of relief and recognition, and nodded her head. She turned back to the table, her lip curling in pure, unadulterated disgust at the men sitting there. "You should be ashamed," she said, the words dropping like lead weights into the silence. Richard looked down at his plate. Garrett looked at the wall. The golden child was a statue of cowardice, unable to even look at the woman he claimed to love. The stage had been flipped. The script was shredded. And for the first time in 29 years, the air in the Weber house felt like it belonged to me. Have you ever had a stranger see your worth when your own blood refused to? If someone outside your family finally told the truth for you, comment witness below. I want to hear about the people who stood up when your family stayed silent. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see these lies burn to the ground. I reached behind my back and untied the apron. I didn't rush. I let the string fall. I let the floral fabric slide off my shoulders and hit the floor in a heap of cheap cotton and grease. I looked at Richard. His eyes were wide, staring at the empty spot on my chest where he'd tried to pin a different identity. "The kitchen is closed, Richard," I said. I turned and walked toward the stairs. I had a duffel bag to pack and a different kind of war to finish. Behind me, I heard the sound of Claire's purse snapping shut. The front door slammed so hard the glass rattled. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Richard fumbled with his wineglass. The Napa Valley Red that Claire brought was wasted on him. He drank it like it was cheap tap water, but his throat seemed to be closing up anyway. The air in the dining room had turned toxic. It smelled of scorched meat, sour sweat, and the sudden sharp scent of a lie being dragged into the light. Richard tried to puff his chest out, but the navy blue polo shirt just looked tight and pathetic over his shaking frame. He was a cornered animal, and his only instinct was to bite. "So what?" Richard finally grunted. His voice was a dry rattle, the sound of a man who'd spent too many years screaming from a sideline. BAMC, Doctor, Captain, Volunteer. It's all just helping folks, ain't it? End of the day, she's still my daughter under my roof. Names and titles don't change the chores that need doing. Clang. Aunt June hit the table so hard the salt shaker tipped over, white grains spilling across the dark wood like snow on a grave. She'd been the quiet one for a decade. The woman who sat in the corner and swallowed her tongue while Richard erased my mother's memory, bit by bit. But the dam hadn't just cracked, it had vanished. "It ain't the same, Richard, and you damn well know it." June's voice was a whip, cracking across the silence. "You can't even say the words, can you? You can't admit your daughter has a PhD. You can't admit she's a captain in the United States Army. You think those silver bars come in a cereal box? You think saving lives is the same as reading a damn bedtime story?" Claire didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She just slid her phone across the table. It spun once and stopped directly in front of Grandma Margot. The screen flickered to life. The audio was grainy, filled with the sterile hum of a hospital ward and the sound of a child crying. Not a normal cry, but the ragged, hollow sob of a kid whose body had forgotten how to work. On the screen, there was a woman on her knees on a hard blue mat. Her OCP sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, her forearms corded with muscle and tension. Sweat was dripping off her chin as she held a young boy by the waist, her face inches from his. "Again, Marcus," the woman in the video said. It was my voice, but it was iron. It was a command. "Fight for it! Don't you dare give up on me!" The boy took a step, a shaky, ugly, beautiful step. The woman in the video caught him, pulling him into her chest as she let out a breath that sounded like a prayer. Grandma Margot pulled her glasses off, her hands trembling as she wiped her eyes with a lace napkin. The neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, looked at Richard with the expression that was pure, unadulterated shame. The model family was dead on the floor. Richard stood up his chair screeching against the oak floor like a dying animal. His face was a mottled purple, the color of a bad bruise. He pointed a thick, shaking finger at me, his eyes bulging. "You think you're better than us?" he roared. His breath smelled of stale beer and desperation. "Your mother told you. She told you on her deathbed, keep this family together. You're failing her, Lena. You're throwing it all away for some damn ego. You made a promise." June didn't flinch. She reached into her weathered leather purse and pulled out a small book. Black leather. Worn at the edges. The spine was cracked from years of being opened in the dark. I felt the air leave my lungs. I knew that book. Mom used to hide it under her mattress, away from Richard's prying, jealous eyes. "Marie gave me this," June said, her voice suddenly soft, cutting through Richard's noise like a razor through silk. 3 days before she passed, she told me to wait. To wait until you pushed her too far. To wait until you tried to use her death to chain her daughter. She threw the book onto the table. It landed with a dull thud. I reached for it. My fingers felt like ice. I opened it to a page marked with a dried, pressed bluebonnet. The handwriting was Mom's, elegant, looping, but shaky from the chemo that was stealing her life. October 14th, it read. Lena was promoted to captain today. My little girl. A doctor and an officer. She's my greatest pride. I watch her in that uniform and I know she'll be okay. She's the only one of us who really made it out. God, please protect her from the bitterness of this house. Let her be free. The family promise wasn't a chain. It was a blessing. The deathbed promise wasn't a contract to be Richard's maid. It was a hope that I'd never look back. Richard had twisted a dying woman's love into a noose, and I'd been wearing it for 3 years. I stood up. I didn't rush. I reached behind my back and untied the knot of that floral apron. I pulled the loop over my head and let it drop. It hit the floor in a heap of cheap cotton and grease. I walked to the mudroom, grabbed my OCP jacket, and slid my arms into the sleeves. I zipped it up, feeling the familiar weight of the silver bars on my shoulders. It felt like armor. It felt like the truth. I walked back into the room. Garrett was staring at his shoes. Richard was leaning on the table, looking like a man who'd just realized he was holding a losing hand in a very expensive game. "I'm done, Richard," I said. My voice was level. "The service is over. I'm not your maid. I'm not Garrett's ghost. And I sure as hell ain't your volunteer." I looked at June and Claire. They stood up in unison. "I'm leaving," I said. "And I'm taking every butterfly in that garage with me." Richard opened his mouth to yell, but the sound died in his throat. I turned my back on him and walked toward the door. Behind me, the silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. The dining room was a tomb. I didn't wait for a rebuttal. I didn't wait for Richard to find his breath or for Garrett to stop staring at the floorboards like they held the secrets to the universe. I just turned. My OCP jacket felt like a second skin now, the fabric stiff and honest. My boots hit the oak floor with a heavy rhythmic thud that signaled the end of the Weber family play. I walked straight through the kitchen, past the scorched roast beef and the spilled wine, and stepped out into the garage. The air out here was different. It was cold, stagnant, and smelled of old motor oil and failure. A single fluorescent bulb hummed overhead, flickering with a rhythmic zip-zip that made the shadows dance against the concrete walls. I didn't hesitate. I moved through the junk, the rusted lawnmowers, and the boxes of Richard's Glory Days trophies until I found it. The cardboard box. I knelt on the cold concrete. My fingers were steady as I pulled back the flaps. There they were. 23 glass butterflies huddled together in the dark. I lifted the case. It was heavier than it looked, carrying the weight of 15 years of my mother's quiet hope. I stood up, cradling the glass against my chest, and walked toward my Jeep. "Lena, wait! Just damn well wait a second." The garage door slammed against the siding. Garrett was standing there, his linen blazer rumpled, sweat beads gleaming on his upper lip. He looked small. Even though he had 6 inches on me, he looked like a kid caught stealing from a tip jar. I didn't stop. I popped the hatch of the Jeep and slid the box onto the flatbed, securing it with a bungee cord. The metal hook snapped into place with a sharp clack. "You can't just walk out like this," Garrett panted, his voice cracking. He was trying to use that big brother tone, but it sounded like paper tearing. "Pop is losing it in there. He's 61, Lena. He don't know how to handle this. He's just old school. You know how he is. Don't blow this whole thing up over a dinner." I turned around. I leaned back against the Jeep, my arms crossed. I didn't look at him with anger. I looked at him the way I look at a patient who keeps picking at a wound and wonders why it won't heal. "How he is," I repeated. The words were flat, stripped of any warmth. "He's an addict, Garrett. He's addicted to being the biggest man in every room, even if he has to burn his own children to stay on the pedestal. And you? You're the one buying the matches." Garrett flinched. He looked at the grease-stained floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "I'm just trying to keep the peace. I got a career to think about. I got Claire. I can't be fighting him every Tuesday." "You ain't keeping the peace," I said, stepping closer. I could smell the gas station wine on his breath. "You're selling me out. You watched him turn my PhD into a joke. You watched him treat me like a maid in a house I pay the taxes on. You sat there and ate that steak while he erased me. All so you could keep your golden child status." Garrett looked up, his eyes darting toward the house. "Pop's gonna cut us both off if you leave. You know he's got the deed to the lake house. You're being selfish, Lena." I let out a short, dry laugh. It sounded like gravel under a boot. "Selfish?" I shook my head. "I spent 3 years being a ghost because Mom asked me to keep this family together. But this ain't a family. It's a hostage situation, and I'm done being the ransom." I climbed into the driver's seat. Garrett grabbed the door handle, his knuckles white. "Lena, come on. Just stay for dessert. We'll talk it out tomorrow. I'll make it up to you, I promise." I looked him dead in the eye. I didn't blink. "Here's how this works, Garrett. Don't call me. Don't text me. The next time you want to speak to me, it won't be in this garage. It'll be after you stand in front of that old man, look him in his face, and tell him exactly who I am. You call me Captain Weber, or you don't call me at all." I pulled the door shut. Garrett stood there, his mouth hanging open, looking like a man who had just realized his safety net was made of smoke. Suddenly, the side door of the garage flew open. Claire stepped out, her plum-colored dress dark in the dim light. She ignored Garrett entirely. She walked straight to my window. She didn't say a word. She just reached in and gripped my hand. Her palm was warm and shaking. She pulled me into a fast, fierce hug through the open window, her hair smelling like expensive shampoo and real tears. "I saw you," she whispered into my ear. "I saw everything. You saved my sister, Lena. Don't you ever let these men make you feel small. You're a goddamn hero." She pulled back, her eyes wet but her jaw set like stone. She looked at Garrett with a disgust so pure it made him wither. "I'm calling an Uber," she told him. I nodded at her, one soldier acknowledging another on a battlefield. I turned the key. The Jeep's engine roared to life, a violent, mechanical growl that filled the garage and drowned out whatever pathetic excuse Garrett was trying to mumble. I shifted into reverse. I backed out of the driveway, the tires screaming against the gravel. I didn't look back at the house. I didn't look back at the flickering porch light or the man cave room that used to be mine. I hit the street and shifted into first. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The Weber house was just a dark shape in the Texas night, a sinking ship full of lies and cheap wine. I was 29 years old. I was a captain. I was a doctor. And for the first time in my life, I was actually going home. But as I hit the highway, a single sharp light appeared in my mirror, a pair of headlights, following me, fast. The I-35 was a black ribbon cutting through the gut of South Texas. I pushed the Jeep to 80, the engine groaning in a low, mechanical growl that felt like the only honest thing left in my world. I'd rolled the window down halfway. The night air was a cold slap, smelling of damp earth and diesel exhaust. It stung my eyes, but I didn't roll it back up. I needed the sting. I needed to know I was still awake. The headlights in my rearview mirror, the ones that had been chasing me since the driveway, had finally flickered and died out miles ago. Garrett had given up. Or maybe Richard had pulled him back. It didn't matter. The tether was cut. The ghost of the Model family was drifting away into the dark, swallowed by the vast empty scrubland between the house and the city. I didn't turn on the radio. Music felt like a lie right now. I just wanted the sound of the tires on the asphalt, a steady rhythmic hum that sounded like a countdown. 4 hours. 4 hours between the girl who washed dishes in a grease-stained apron and the woman who commanded a ward. I reached over to the passenger seat. My hand brushed the cool, worn leather of Mom's journal. It was sitting right on top of the box of glass butterflies. I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my chest, a physical pressure that made it hard to swallow. A few miles outside of San Antonio, I pulled off the main highway. I found a small gravel-strewn intersection where the streetlights were spaced too far apart, flickering with a dying orange buzz. I stopped at a red light that seemed to last forever. There was no one else on the road, no one to watch, no one to judge. I picked up the book. My fingers traced the cracks in the spine. I turned to the very last page, where the ink was smudged, likely by her own tears 3 years ago. The handwriting was a jagged mess, the loops of the letters collapsing into themselves. I didn't make Lena promise to stay for Richard. The ink bled into the paper. I didn't make her promise because I thought he needed her. I made her promise because I was terrified. I was scared that once I was gone, she'd look at this house and realize there was no love left for her here. I was scared she'd have no one. I wanted to give her a reason to stay, even if that reason was a lie. The realization hit me like a mortar round. My mother hadn't tried to enslave me. She'd tried to shield me from the cold truth of my father's heart. She'd used a promise as a desperate, clumsy anchor, hoping I wouldn't drift away into total isolation. She was wrong. Dead wrong. But it wasn't malice. It was the fear of a woman who knew she was leaving her daughter in a den of wolves. The light turned green. I didn't move. I sat there, the Jeep idling, the vibration of the floorboards rattling my bones. I stared at the dashboard. My throat began to tighten. A hot, jagged lump formed in my chest, rising up until I couldn't breathe. Then, the first sob broke. It wasn't a quiet, ladylike whimper. It was a violent, guttural sound, a roar of grief that had been bottled up for 29 years. I slumped forward, my head hitting the steering wheel. The leather was cold against my forehead. I cried for the 10-year-old girl who'd spent her Saturdays scrubbing baseboards while her brother went to the movies. I cried for the teenager who'd hidden her straight-A report cards because she didn't want to upset Richard's golden boy. I cried for every hour I'd spent in that floral apron, swallowing my pride like a mouthful of broken glass just to keep a peace that didn't exist. The tears were thick and salt-heavy, burning tracks down my face and dripping onto the OCP jacket I'd fought so hard to earn. I let it out, every ounce of the invisibility, every ounce of the shame. I let the silence of the Texas night carry it away. 10 minutes, maybe 20. I didn't check the clock. When I finally lifted my head, my face felt tight and raw, but the weight in my chest had shifted. The pressure was gone. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, the rough fabric of my sleeve scratching my skin. I took a deep, shaky breath, smelling the ozone of an approaching storm. I shifted the Jeep into gear and drove. At 0200 hours, I pulled up to the main gate of Fort Sam Houston. The floodlights were blinding, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete barriers. I rolled down the window and handed my ID to the MP in the booth. The soldier, a young specialist with a crisp beret and eyes that looked like they'd seen a dozen shifts like this, took the card. He looked at the photo, then at me. He didn't see a maid. He didn't see a volunteer who read stories. He snapped a sharp, perfectly timed salute. "Good morning, Captain Weber," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet night. "Welcome back, ma'am." I felt a ghost of a smile touch my lips. I snapped a salute back, my hand steady, my spine like a steel rod. "Thank you, specialist." I drove through the gate. This was my kingdom. Not a house of lies, but a world of discipline, honor, and people who knew exactly what those silver bars meant. I reached my quarters, a small, sparse room on the upper floor of the officers' housing. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked over to the box and carefully took out the 23 glass butterflies. One by one, I lined them up on the windowsill. The glass caught the first, faint gray light of the approaching dawn, shimmering with a quiet, fragile strength. They weren't hidden in a garage anymore. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at them. The mission was over. The extraction was complete. But as I reached for my phone to finally block Garrett's number, a single notification popped up. It wasn't from him. It was a link to a local news site sent from an unknown number. The headline made my blood turn to ice. 3 days later, the digital chirp of my desk phone broke the heavy silence of my office at BAMC. The afternoon sun was cutting through the blinds in sharp, clinical strips, highlighting the dust motes dancing over my medical journals. I didn't check the caller ID. I already knew the frequency of the ghost haunting my line. "Garrett, speak," I said. My voice was a flat line of steel. There was a long, ragged pause on the other end. I could hear the wet, unsteady breathing of a man who'd spent 72 hours looking over his shoulder. Garrett sounded small. He sounded like a man who'd finally realized his golden child status was a currency that had been devalued to zero. I did it, Lena," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. I sat him down, right there at the kitchen table. Before the neighbor came over this morning, I looked him in the eye. I told him he had to stop. I told him, "You're Captain Weber." I said it 3 times until he stopped trying to shout over me. It was a pathetic, late-to-the-game surrender, a coward's retreat forced by the fear of losing his girlfriend and his reputation. I didn't offer him a thank you. I didn't offer him a seat back at my table. I just watched a bird fly past my window, its wings dark against the blue San Antonio sky. "Copy. Information received," I said. "Lena, wait." I hung up. The click of the receiver was a period at the end of a long, ugly sentence. I didn't need his growth. I just needed his compliance. 2 weeks later, Aunt June provided the tactical intel. She called me while she was out grocerying. Her voice hushed with a mixture of shock and a strange, flickering hope. "He's quiet, Lena," she whispered. "Too quiet. He bought a medical dictionary from that old bookstore on Main Street. I caught him in his recliner, hunched over the pages like he was studying for a bar exam. He was looking up Doctor of Physical Therapy. He had a notepad out, scribbling down how many years of school it took you. And the ranks. He was on that old computer for hours, searching where a captain sits in the pecking order compared to a regional manager. The image was stark. Richard Weber, the man who thought a high school whistle was the ultimate scepter of power, was finally being forced to educate himself on the greatness he'd tried to bury. He wasn't doing it out of love. He was doing it out of a desperate need to understand the size of the enemy he'd created. 6 weeks passed. The phone rang again at 2100 hours. I let it ring 4 times before I picked up. I didn't say hello. I just waited. The silence on the line was heavy, smelling of stale tobacco and the kind of loneliness that only hits when the house is too big and the lies are too thin. Richard's voice was a ghost of its former self. Gone was the coach's roar. Gone was the booming arrogance of the man at the head of the table. "What can I do?" he asked. The words were a white flag, tattered and gray. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the 23 glass butterflies on my windowsill. They caught the moonlight, glowing with a cold, clear fire. "The rules of engagement are simple, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the static. "The next time you have a guest, any guest, you will use my name. You will use my title. You will say, 'This is my daughter, Captain Lena Weber.' You will not mention volunteering. You will not mention stories. You will tell them exactly what I've earned." "I bought a shelf," he croaked. "A new one. Solid oak. I put it back in the garage where the old one was. It's waiting for the butterflies." "Keep the shelf," I said. "The butterflies stay with me." Richard didn't argue. He just let out a long, shuddering breath and agreed. The tyrant had learned to follow orders. 4 months later, the Texas air had turned crisp, smelling of wood smoke and dried cedar. Thanksgiving. I drove the Jeep back to the house, but I didn't wear the floral apron. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer and slacks, my back straight, my head held high. I didn't go to the kitchen. I didn't touch a single dish. I sat on the velvet sofa, my legs crossed, watching the game on TV, while the smell of baked yams drifted through the hallway. Garrett was in the kitchen. I could hear the splash of dishwater and the rhythmic clink of porcelain as he scrubbed the pans. He was the one with grease on his elbows now. He was the one playing the ghost. When the door opened and the Pattersons walked in, Richard stood up. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small jagged piece of paper, a note he'd written to himself so he wouldn't fail the mission. He cleared his throat, his eyes flicking to the paper, then to me. "Everyone," Richard said, his voice steady but stripped of its old sting. "I'd like you to meet my daughter. This is Captain Lena Weber. She's a doctor of physical therapy and a specialist in pediatric rehabilitation at BAMC." The Pattersons blinked, the room going still. Mrs. Patterson looked at me with a new kind of weight in her eyes, a respect that had been 29 years in the making. I didn't get up. I just lifted my teacup, the steam curling around my face, and offered a small, razor-sharp smile. "Nice to see you again," I said. The battle was over. The extraction was complete. I didn't need his pride. I didn't need his hug. I had my own dawn now, and it was brighter than anything he'd ever tried to extinguish. I looked at the empty spot on the wall where the old shelf used to be. I set my tea down, stood up, and walked out the front door without saying goodbye. If you finally stopped waiting for their apology and started demanding their respect, comment "Sovereign" below. Let's show the world that a title isn't just a word, it's a boundary. Like and subscribe to Close the Book on this war. See you in the next part.